What do you know about the Shroud of Turin? This isn't about religion. This is about science and an image on a sheet of cloth. Now, that doesn't mean that other people don't see this from a religious point of view. It took me 17 years after we finished before the scientific evidence finally convinced me this has got to be the real thing.
Ah.
And it's not from a religious or theological point of view, but from a purely scientific point of view. The most plausible explanation is that they have preserved an artifact of the historical Jesus of Nazareth. Why would somebody preserve something like that in the first place? Unless it belonged to someone of such great importance that it was worth the risk. They wouldn't have kept it for 2,000 years. If it had belonged to anyone else, it wouldn't have mattered. You don't need to be a Christian to accept the peer-reviewed science based on direct physical examination of the cloth, and to accept the historicity of Jesus of Nazareth, to accept that we have an artifact of that man whose influence is still being felt on this planet more so than when he was alive.
So this is something you're never going to hear me say. This particular documentary was laid upon my heart, and I have to follow through. After 18 months on the road, for some reason, the Shroud of Turin popped into my head, and I had to make a video because we're in some really crazy times right now, and this is literal physical proof. It's a 2,000-year-old picture of Jesus that Jesus created himself, with over 500,000 hours being put into trying to duplicate this, trying to debunk it. People haven't been able to. And it turns out in the last couple of years, evidence has come forward that's shown that all the debunking was not scientific. It was political or religious. Jesus left us a picture of himself. You might want to check this out.
That Jesus died, was buried, and descended to the dead. And on the third day he rose. Intense bright light emitted from his body imprinted his image on the shroud. The shroud is a photograph of the resurrection.
I mean, just recently they verified the Shroud of Turin. Have you seen that?
I've been reading about it, and I know that there's some contention, there's some discussion and debate about it, but they used to think that it was only a couple hundred years old.
Yeah.
And now they've changed that.
Yeah, they said no, it's back then.
They also don't understand how it was made, which to me is very fascinating because it's not paint. It's not. They don't know what caused the image itself and how that technology would have even been available.
It wasn't. No.
A couple thousand years ago.
An intense light. I mean, atomic. To leave almost like a photographic imprint on a piece of cloth.
Yeah.
So before we dive into this much deeper, I'm going to explain to people that may not know exactly what the Shroud of Turin is. It's a linen cloth that measures 14 feet by 3 inches long, or 4.3 meters, and it measures 3 foot 7 inches wide, or 1.1 meters. It portrays two faint brownish images, those of the back and front of a gaunt, sunken-eyed, 5 foot 7 inch tall man, and it appears as if the body has been laid on its back lengthwise along one half of the shroud, while the other half of the shroud has been doubled over the head to cover the whole front of the body from face to feet. The images contain markings that allegedly correspond to the crucifixion wounds of Jesus, including the thorn marks from the crown of thorns and lacerations from the cat of nine whippings on the back, bruises on his shoulders from carrying the cross, and various stains that are presumed to be blood. So there's no confusion. The Shroud of Turin is distinct from the Veil of Veronica, which is depicted in the Stations of the Cross as a piece of fabric that was imprinted with Christ's face during his walk to Golgotha. Now, this is when it was first found. The first historical accounts of the shroud occur in 1354, when it is recorded that it wound up in the hands of a famed knight, Geoffrey de Charnay, and Signor de Larry. There is no record of how he came into possession of it. In 1389, when it went on exhibition, the shroud was denounced as false by the local bishop of Troyes, who declared it cunningly painted, the truth being attested by an artist who painted it. The Avignon anti-Pope Clement reigned from 1378 to 1394, refrained from expressing his opinion on the shroud's authenticity, but sanctioned its use as an object of devotion, provided that it be exhibited as an image or representation of the true shroud. However, subsequent popes from Julius II took the shroud's authenticity for granted. In 1453, Geoffrey de Charnay's granddaughter Marguerite gave the shroud to the House of Savoy at Chambéry, and there it was damaged by fire and water in 1532. Now remember that. That's going to be important. It was moved to the new Savoyard capital of Turin in 1578, and ever since it's been publicly exhibited only rarely, as on the marriage of Prince Umberto in 1931 and on the 400th anniversary of his arrival in Turin, 1978. In 1998 and 2000, Pope John Paul arranged for a public viewing. He called the shroud a mirror of the gospel. Pope Benedict similarly arranged a public display in 2010, and Pope Francis made a pilgrimage to see it in 2015. A replica of the shroud is housed in the Museum of the Shroud in Turin. So that's a brief history of where the shroud actually came from, who found it, etc. But what I want to talk to you about is the guy that quite accidentally, got an actual photograph of Jesus Christ's face off of the shroud. His name was Secondo Pia, and in 1898, his life as a 43-year-old lawyer from Turin and an amateur photographer seemed as if it was going to be like yours and mine, and those of most human beings. But something unexpected happened that some might call luck. Definitely changed the script of the other 43 years that remained until his death. A script that was characterized by initial popularity, by a long subsequent discredit, and finally by his rehabilitation at the end of his life. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about Secondo Pia, back in the 1800s, literally taking a picture of the Shroud of Turin, and that stroke of luck made him famous and is well known by now. Between May 25th and 28th, 1898, after working really hard at overcoming technical setbacks, Secondo Pia was the first to photograph one of the most valuable Christian relics, the Shroud of Turin. The white linen allegedly believed to have wrapped Christ's corpse after his crucifixion, but this piece of cloth, from the point of view of science, was nothing more than a pious article, something of interest just for its devotees. What neither Pia nor anyone else could suspect is that the development of those first photographs was going to reveal something greater and unprecedented. The shroud itself is a photographic negative. The image of the man in the relic is printed with the light, dark areas of the picture reversed, as in a photographic negative. In Pia's eyes, the shroud emerged from the development tray as the first photograph in history. Yeah. And of course, having a common man discovering that the Shroud of Turin was indeed 100% proof that Jesus Christ lived, died, and resurrected made a lot of people mad. And the fact Pia suffered criticism and contempt for tilting the balance towards the authenticity of this relic. And it's been going on to this very day, where science does not want this to be proven. It's inconclusive, it's a forgery, it's this, that, it's the other thing, when in fact it's literal proof. Now, if you want to know more about this, I'll leave links below to PDF documents that tell the entire story. I can't do it all here because this video would be way too long, at any rate. So long story longer, this guy took this photograph accidentally. While developing pictures of the Shroud of Turin, he accidentally noticed the negative was showing the face. So imagine this. Christ dies to save us all from our sins. All we have to do is believe in him. And this guy takes a photograph of the Shroud of Turin, and only in its negative form did it actually show a picture of Jesus Christ. So Jesus was able to give us not only the Shroud of Turin as proof, but an actual photograph from when he was crucified. That is utterly insane. But over the years, science, the Vatican, religious figures, people in power didn't want this message out because this would completely ruin their Darwinism theory of evolution. Do you see what I'm saying? Where that we're the best that we've ever been, when in fact humanity is basically like a printer copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. And every year that passes, humanity is going lower on the rungs. That's just how it is. But science has gone out of their way to disprove this for so very many reasons, and we're going to get into that right now. When you look at the Shroud of Turin, it shows a man with his arms crossed. The picture shows his right side, and then it shows his back, and the left side shows his front. But if you look closely, you'll notice the man's injuries are exactly like the ones described in the Gospel. Crucifixion, blood wounds on his wrist and his feet are exactly like they would be if he was nailed to a cross. There's a gash in his side that matches the spear of destiny, or the spear wound described in the Gospel. And there's even scarring on his head that you'd find from a crown of thorns, as well as his entire body is covered with scourge marks from being whipped by the Roman soldiers. I mean, it's pretty compelling. But over the years, everybody's tried to debunk it.
And you can see it, that it depicts a first century Hebrew male, because the hairstyle was from the first century, and a Hebrew hairstyle, that he was about 6 feet tall, that he was completely scourged all over his body. He was crucified, scourged, beaten, the wounds on the thorns, the hands, the feet, and the scourging. And the hairstyle was from the first century. And the pollens that they found in the cloth were from that region.
Yeah.
Also, the weave was a first century weave that was typical. And another guy, an archaeologist who I knew, who actually translated the Passion into Aramaic, told me that if you look close, you can see the image of a Tiberius coin marks on the eyes. Now, I don't know if that's real or not. I've never actually checked that, but that there's images of Tiberius on the coin.
Because they would put the coins over the eyes?
Yeah.
So let's talk about the analysis that have been done on this thing to prove or disprove its authenticity. And bear in mind, the Shroud of Turin is one of the most studied relics in human history, with over 500,000 hours from all different lines, science, religious, etc., weighing in on this over the years. This thing has been researched, and for the most part, forever, it was being debunked. Attempting to use scientific methods to prove or disprove its authenticity have been applied to the shroud since the late 19th century. In 1898, it was noticed that the sepia tone images of the shroud seemed to have the character of photographic negatives rather than positives. Now, for those that are wondering what a sepia tone camera is, sepia photography refers to a type of monochrome photography in which the images are rendered in shades of brown instead of the grayscale tones typical of black and white photography. This brown tinting effect gives a sepia photograph a warm and antique appearance, but in this case, they are antique, and it is naturally warm. So, there you go. And over the years, every type of photography has been employed to try to figure out what this thing was, to debunk it or to prove it one way or the other. Every type of camera was used. It's insane. Three-dimensional experiments with the image of the Shroud of Turin, all sorts of different things. The sepia cam, Peter Schumacher with his VP8 image analyzer, These guys went over this thing tooth and nail for years and years and years. And anytime somebody would get something conclusive, magically somebody would step in and it would be inconclusive, or the media would just completely do what they do and debunk it. You see what I'm saying? They even did holographic imaging, which is very, very expensive and time consuming. And the different steps involved in the production of the holograms were photographs being used were first and second generation copies of the N-ray photographs of 1931. Digitization of the photographs were digitized with 7,000 to 10.000 pixels, and Barry Schwartz's expertise solution for the imageless area on the right side of the face. 2D to 3D conversion was done by Bernardo Galmarini in Argentina and later perfected by the Dutch Holographic Laboratory. The creation of master hologram, Dutch holograph photography, and copies of masters, also other 3D products, lenticulars, and anaglyph photographs. These guys studied this thing heavily, seriously heavily. Beginning in the 1970s, tests were made to determine whether the images were the result of paints or other pigments, scorches or other agents. None of the tests proved conclusive, shockingly enough, because if this was proved conclusively, it would do several things. Mainly, it would disturb their quote-unquote theory of evolution, which has absolutely nothing to back it up other than a theory. Darwin himself actually said, the only problem with my theory is I have no evidence. So over the years, they've simply been manufacturing evidence, and proof of Jesus Christ would ruin everything. Did you ever notice there's one religion you can make fun of all you want, but all the other ones are sacred? There's a reason for that. But here's the thing these guys hang their hats on big time. In 1988, 3 radiocarbon laboratories dated samples of the Shroud of Turin and boldly announced that it was a medieval forgery, dating to the period 1260 or 1380 AD.
In 1988, carbon dating stated that the Shroud of Turin was from the 14th century. This caused many people to dismiss the shroud. But was the analysis done properly? In 2005, a member of the original Shroud research team answered this in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. Here's what he said.
I had given up on the shroud, and this was about the same time that the lunatic fringe were coming up with an infinite number of ways the date could be wrong, and this was just the last straw.
I got a call from Ray, and he goes, "This is nonsense. I can prove these people wrong in 5 minutes." And I said, "Well, Ray, go for it."
So I read their paper, and I thought, I've got the samples that can shoot that full of holes. So I got out the Ross samples, and I got out the Shroud samples, and I went to work again.
He discovered that the wrong samples were selected for the dating. He concluded, the radiocarbon sample was thus not part of the original cloth and was invalid for determining the age of the shroud. He also calculated a new date between 1300 and 3000 years old. Again, this is from a well-rated, published peer-reviewed journal. What he believes happened is this.
If you happen to hit a place where a yarn segment from the original shroud was spliced into the new reweave part, the splice very definitely shows the new yarn that was being put in and dyed to match. The only thing in the shroud that was dyed or stained was this radiocarbon area.
His findings were confirmed by John Brown from Georgia Tech and Bob Villarreal from Los Alamos National Laboratory. I've received many comments that say that Wikipedia disagrees with the findings of Ray Rogers, so we should ignore it. However, I would recommend looking into the sources, as they even mention that the date may be incorrect. With all this said, I prefer to believe the man who obtained actual samples from the shroud and published his findings in a peer-reviewed journal. And here's some more detail from Ray Rogers.
Until I could get a sample from the real radiocarbon cloth, a documented sample, I couldn't prove anything. The authentic radiocarbon sample that I got, these segments of yarn were cut from the middle of the radiocarbon sample, so there was no question about them. And when I looked at these samples from the radiocarbon area, there's no problem at all finding cotton in them. You've got photomicrographs that demonstrate this very clearly. The cotton fibers from the radiocarbon sample are fairly heavily coated with the gum dye mordant. And when we went back and looked at the ultraviolet photographs, here is this area that's significantly darker. It doesn't fluoresce as much, and it's just this area that, around the raw sample and where the radiocarbon sample was cut. And if they had looked at any of the photographs that we had and studied the information we had as of 1978, they would have known that that was the worst possible place they could have taken a sample. The people who certified the sample are still trying to convince everybody that everybody else is wrong. They're right. Those were perfectly valid samples.
Remember those fires I told you about, specifically the one back in the 1500s? Well, after that fire, some of the Shroud of Turin was repaired. And those repair parts, or patches, are what were given for radiocarbon dating. See, they don't mention that. So it did actually go back to the 1500s because it was repaired. But again, this is what they hang their hats on. And again, there's a reason that they didn't want this information out. So there, as they say, is that. That's in a nutshell what the Shroud of Turin has been thought of for time immemorial. Many steadfast Christians understand the significance of the Shroud of Turin. First of all, Jesus literally supernaturally left a picture, a photograph of himself. There's a woman that I believe was an astrophysicist, and I cannot find it to save my life. But I remember this vividly, where she said, this would require so much electricity, so much power, it would require the power of the sun to literally put an image on this cloth. And being a woman of science, she didn't realize what she had said. It would require the power of the sun of God. Do you know what I mean? She didn't even realize it at the time. At any rate, the conclusion of the 3 radiocarbon laboratories was completely incompatible with the findings from the previous 90 years of shroud studies. But as far as the radiocarbon scientists were concerned, and most of the world's media, this was now the only evidence that mattered. The dating result and conclusion was the shroud was a medieval forgery, made headlines worldwide, and was devastating news for the millions who had believed the shroud to be a sacred relic. However, shortly after the publication of the test reports, many scientists began to raise concerns that this test had fallen short of acceptable scientific practices. I'm shocked. With several breaches of agreed test protocols and controversial statistical interpretation of the dating measurements. Sadly, these revelations failed to generate a fraction of the publicity given to the controversial carbon-14 dating results. Yeah. And we even had gatekeepers of real history, the Smithsonian Institute, put a video up on their YouTube channel showing you how to fake the Shroud of Turin, in case you happen to have an extra 34 trillion watts of power laying around. But, don't let that stop you.
Well, it's such a crazy thing to even try to verify. What are you saying? You're saying that this is really the shroud that Jesus was covered in? So you're saying Jesus historically absolutely did exist, and we think that this is the shroud that covered him. That alone, incredulity, people's immediately their hackles raised, like, wait a minute, and they just instead of like looking at it objectively, they almost always want to look at it from a point of view of disproving it immediately, dismissing it immediately.
But that's science, isn't it? You have to sort of you play the devil's advocate.
So before you try to follow the Smithsonian Institute's how-to video on how to fake the Shroud of Turin, remember this one little thing. This entire cloth, the image of Jesus was only on the very top layer of the linen. The very top layer, like it was seared there. Do you see what I mean? Which it was. It's supernatural. It's Jesus' burial cloth. And it turns out that all of a sudden, science has done a complete 360 or a 180. How about that? A 180. Where suddenly science believes in the Shroud of Turin. It's amazing. But before I jump into that, let's look at this real quick. Light can be considered in both its physical and metaphysical forms. In metaphysical terms, light has various meanings. Number one, light as the first manifestation of God, described in the book of Genesis. Number two, light as a metaphor for God in a spiritual sense. 3. Light as a manifestation of God on further occasions, as in the Transfiguration. 4. Light as a representation of goodness and truth. This is particularly an aspect of Eastern religions. And 5. Light as a description of God. The Gospel of St. John makes reference to this. I just wanted to put that out there real quick to understand that no man comes to the Father except through Jesus. He is the way, the truth, and the life. Just saying. So after years and years and years and years and years of science and authorities and quote-unquote experts and scientists and doctors telling the faithful that something that they knew to be real was completely fake, it turns out the worm has turned. The ridicule has been lifted. Suddenly, they've decided the Shroud of Turin is completely real. Well, as real as they're going to allow it to be. But let me introduce you to something called the Sudarium Oviedo. And what this was a piece of cloth that was placed over Jesus' face after the Roman soldiers crucified and eventually killed him. And the thing about this is, it's been compared to the Shroud of Turin by scientists. They compared the blood stains, they compared the patterns of the wounds of the Sudarium to the Shroud of Turin, and it was almost perfect. And it wasn't just like 100 points of similarity. Even the flow patterns of the blood were the same. And more importantly, the Sudarium has a documented history that goes all the way back to the 6th century. And that's way further back than the Shroud of Turin, which just popped in the 14th century. Do you see what I mean? So with that in mind, anybody that forged this back in the medieval days that somehow had access to 34 trillion watts of energy that could literally scorch cloth or sear the cloth from the inside out, but only sear the image on the very top layer without damaging the layers of cloth underneath, yeah, he would have had to have been one hell of a forger back then. Do you see what I'm saying? In August of 2024, researchers figured out, or they did a study with a new bloodstain analysis of the shroud, and they found that the blood carries an extremely high level of creatine and ferritin chemical markers that they flood the body when someone gets killed or they experience massive trauma like being whipped, crucified, severe torture, things of that nature. So for somebody to be able to forge that, yeah, it just isn't happening. It just isn't happening. So in addition to those new tests, scientists also did testing with something called wide-angle X-ray scattering. And this is to test the molecular structure of the shroud's fibers. And what they found is the fibers in the cloth closely match fabrics discovered at ancient sites, specifically in early or 1st century Israel, not medieval Europe. And even with that being said, people are still going to argue. But I'm presenting this information for the faithful, or for the people that are on the fence but just need a little bit more proof. When faith alone isn't enough, Jesus supernaturally, literally left an image of himself, a picture before pictures were available. But that's not all. Because in January of 2025, they did a new analysis of the original carbon-14 testing, and it revealed some inconsistencies and mishandling, suggesting they were wrong. They were wrong. They pulled a patch from the shroud that was originally a repair to the fire that occurred. For as much as they wanted people to believe that this was a hoax, that this was a forgery, the truth is coming out, and we are at the times right now where the truth will be revealed to all. They found pollen that matched specifically to samples taken from the same area in Israel in the 1st century. They found the weave was the same. They found that the fabrics were the same. So suddenly, all these years of people being told what you think or what you believe is wrong, it seems like the worm has turned. And with this new evidence now available, it seems like it's affecting certain people, and I'm really happy to see that. I had a conversation a few months ago with a friend of mine who's an author of Confusion in Christianity and Confusion in the Cosmos. 2 books that I recommended on my channels before, and 2 books that I've read cover to cover more than 4 times. That's a fact. And what I had said to him is, I find it really strange that somebody with the largest podcast on earth, referring to Joe Rogan, suddenly out of nowhere has not only Mel Gibson on, who explains the resurrection, the Shroud of Turin, Jesus' life, but then he has Wes Huff on, who also explains to him that the Bible is in fact true and that there are backups, meaning the Dead Sea Scrolls back up the Bible 99.9%. Except for a few iterations in wording or translations, the Dead Sea Scrolls back up the Bible, and then he has Mel Gibson explaining the Shroud of Turin, that is an actual, literal photograph of Jesus. I said to my friend who's the author, I said, Miguel, I find it strange that God has placed these 2 people out of all the people that Joe has interviewed over the years with all their different quote-unquote expertise in areas that debunk the Bible, Jesus, and God. Suddenly he has these 2 guys on, and then wouldn't you know, suddenly Joe Rogan has stopped drinking, he stopped smoking marijuana, and now he's going to church. I'd have to say that's God's hand in action. And I can only imagine how many people in the audience of Joe's millions of followers have found their way to Jesus as well. This is an amazing thing. It's an amazing time. While the world is completely falling apart, certain truths are being revealed.
Conversation with him.
Well, my conversation with Rogan went 3 hours and 15 minutes.
Oh, my goodness.
It was a little bit longer than this conversation. But yes, Joe Rogan and I have had on and off communication since then. I can tell you for a fact that he is attending a church and that that has been a consistent thing. And so, you know, things are happening, and he's a very inquisitive individual, and I think for the better, in that he's communicating with me and other people in his life who are influences that can speak into, you know, these issues of reliability and trustworthiness and verisimilitude of something like the pages of Scripture, and where he should and shouldn't be looking for the information in regards to that. So I am very encouraged by the communication that I have been able to have with him and others over these last few months in this kind of crazy season that I find myself in. But we're seeing what I don't think is an exaggeration to say somewhat of a resurgence in interest in these topics that we've been talking about, even the nitty-gritty. We had someone who reached out to us recently at Apologetics Canada, who is probably the last bricks and mortar Christian bookstore that I've ever heard of. But they said, we have people walking through our doors asking, young people, teenagers, saying, I want a Bible. All my friends are reading this thing. Wow. So if the Bible is, you know, becoming popular with teenagers, then something is happening and the Lord is moving.
That's McKenna's great line. Terrence McKenna had a great line about the difference between science and religion is that science only asks you for one miracle. I want you to believe in one miracle, the Big Bang.
Yeah. That's a good one.
It's a great line.
Yeah.
It's because it really is true.
Yes.
And it's funny because people would be incredulous about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, but yet they're convinced that the entire universe was smaller than the head of a pin, and for no reason than anybody's adequately explained to me. It makes sense.
Yeah. No.
Instantaneously became everything.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can't buy that.
I'm sticking with Jesus on that one. Like, Jesus makes more sense.
What I was trying to get Billy in that conversation that I had with him to get to the bottom of partly was a question of methodology. Like, I think he got frustrated at me at one point because I kept asking, you know, what are the criteria that you're using when you're looking at one source versus another source and coming up with a conclusion? Because in historiography, it's the inference to the best explanation. And so there are different ways that you go about that, different methodologies. And historians very rarely disagree on the data and the evidence. It's the conclusions that you draw from that.
Right.
But then there are some things that are just out and out false. And I don't think Billy totally knew what I was talking about, but it's those criteria that we look at when we look at something that does come from like an oral tradition and eventually gets written down and becomes a literary text. And then you analyze that on the basis of it being a literary text.
There are older versions.
The Dead Sea Scrolls are the oldest of the Old Testament. So when they were discovered, so they were discovered in 1946 to 1957. And at that point, during their discovery, they pushed back a lot of our previous oldest manuscripts 1,000 years, which was a big deal.
How old are they?
They're anywhere between the 3rd century BC and the 1st century BC. And it's a number of different languages. So the vast majority of it is in Hebrew, but there's also a lot in Aramaic and then Greek and in Nabatean. So it's like an umbrella term to just describe a whole bunch of literature. And when we're talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, like you have ones like the Great Isaiah Scroll, which is fully complete. Like it's a copy of the book of Isaiah, and it's a full complete scroll. But then other ones are so fragmentary that we think they're written in Hebrew, but we can't actually tell. So that one is fascinating. So this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but when we discovered the Great Isaiah Scroll, previous to that, the earliest copy of Isaiah that we had was in the Masoretic text, which is in the Middle Ages.
Whoa.
Yeah, so it was literally 1,000 years. We literally pushed back our understanding of Isaiah 1,000 years. And the thing that really shocked scholars, like I said, this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but one of the things that shocked them about Isaiah was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Word for word.
Word for word.
Wow.
So to put a point on this, I guess, everything is being revealed. No truth will not have a light shone upon it in these times. And we are looking down the barrel of the end of America for the most part. As you can see, currently right now they're rioting in LA. The National Guard's been called in, and I'm sure that will spread because that's the agenda. At any rate, if God can reach somebody like Joe Rogan, who has made a career of listening to quote-unquote experts telling him things that are all anti-Jesus, anti-God, everything is little green men, they're all coming from outer space. If God can move in a way to reach him and a large portion of his audience, something's going on. And that's all there is to it. My point on making this video was Jesus went out of his way knowing that there would be a lot of doubting Thomases in the end times and left a literal photograph of himself doing something no other man has done ever. He came back from the dead, and he will be returning again. And all you have to do is believe in him, follow his commandments. It's not that difficult. And find yourself someone to baptize you and be born again in the name of Jesus Christ. Richie from Boston. I'm out.